The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell against the tall windows of the royal palace in a steady, relentless rhythm, turning the world outside into a blur of gray. Inside, the corridors were quiet, the kind of heavy silence that settles into old buildings with thick stone walls and long histories. For the guards, the night shift was always the same, long hours of standing still, watching nothing happen, listening to the wind and the rain. Elias Thorne had held his post at the southern corridor for just over 2 years. It was not a glorious position. He was not one of the ceremonial guards in the gleaming uniforms who stood motionless for tourists to photograph. Elias was part of the night watch, the men who patrolled the private wings long after the chandeliers were dimmed and the courtiers had gone to bed. And he was a practical man, a former soldier who had taken this job for the steady pay and the quiet. He liked the quiet. It gave him time to think, or to not think, which was sometimes even better. On this particular night, the palace felt different. The storm had knocked out a transformer somewhere on the grounds, and the lights in this section of the corridor had been flickering for the past hour. Maintenance had promised to send someone, but in a building this old and this large, promises moved slowly. Elias adjusted his stance, the leather of his boots creaking softly against the stone floor. He checked the heavy iron ring on his belt, the one that held the master keys to every door in this wing. It was a responsibility he did not take lightly. It was just past 1 in the morning when he first heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. The palace made all kinds of sounds at night, groaning pipes, rattling shutters, the creak of old timber settling. But this was different. It was a sound so faint he almost missed it, a thin, high-pitched note that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He held his breath and listened. There it was again, a sob, small and muffled, like someone was trying very hard to be quiet, but could not hold it in any longer. Elias turned his head, trying to locate the source. It was coming from the east wing, the princess's wing. His stomach tightened. Princess Charlotte was only 7 years old. He had seen her sometimes during the day, running through the gardens with her brothers, her laughter echoing across the lawns. She was a lively child, full of questions and energy. She was not supposed to be crying in the middle of the night. Elias walked quickly but quietly down the corridor, his footsteps barely making a sound. The sobbing grew louder as he approached the heavy oak door that led to the princess's private sitting room, which connected to her bedroom beyond. He stopped outside and listened. The crying was unmistakable now. It was the sound of a child, utterly distressed, the kind of crying that came from deep in the chest, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Between the sobs, Elias could hear words, broken and desperate. "Go away, please. I want my mummy. Please make it stop." Elias's hand went to the door handle. He turned it gently. Locked. He knocked, soft at first. "Your Highness? Are you all right in there?" The crying stopped for a moment, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. Then it started again, louder this time, as if his voice had somehow made it worse. "Go away!" The little voice was terrified. "Don't come in! Don't open the door!" Elias's training told him to stay calm, to follow protocol. Protocol said that a guard did not enter a royal child's room without direct authorization from a senior officer or a member of the family. Protocol said to radio in, wait for backup, wait for someone from the household staff to arrive with the proper keys. But Protocol did not have to listen to a 7-year-old girl sounding like her world was ending. "Your Highness," he said through the door, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he used to talk to frightened young soldiers on the battlefield. "My name is Elias. I'm one of the guards. I'm here because I heard you crying. Can you tell me what's wrong? Are you hurt?" For a long moment there was only the sound of crying and the rain against the windows. Then a tiny voice so quiet he had to press his ear against the wood to hear it. "There's something in my room." Elias felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something? What do you mean, something? I saw it, the girl whispered. It was standing at the end of my bed. It was all dark and it was watching me. I hid under my covers, but I can still feel it. Please, I want my mummy. Elias's mind raced through possibilities. An intruder? It was possible, though the palace security was tight. A servant who had wandered into the wrong room? Unlikely at this hour. A trick of the light? A shadow cast by the storm? That was probably it. Children had active imaginations, especially during storms. But he could not take that chance. "Oh, Your Highness, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said. "I want you to stay exactly where you are. Don't come out from under your covers. I'm going to get help and we're going to make sure you're safe. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," came the tiny reply, followed by another sob. Elias turned and ran. He found the senior duty officer in the guard room, a stout man named Captain Harris, who was nursing a cup of cold tea and looking thoroughly bored with the world. Elias explained the situation quickly, the crying, the locked door, the child's claim of something in her room. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Probably a nightmare. Kids have them. The lady-in-waiting is on her way. She has a key. Wait for her." "With respect, sir, the child is terrified. She's been crying for a while before I even heard her." "How, we can't just stand here." Harris gave him a long, tired look. "Thorne, do you know what happens if we barge into that room and it's nothing? If we scare her even more? If the king gets word that his daughter was woken in the night by guards breaking down her door? We follow procedure. We wait for the lady-in-waiting." Elias nodded, but his jaw was tight. He went back to the corridor and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The crying through the door had not stopped. If anything, it had grown more exhausted, more desperate. The sound of a child who had been crying so long she had no tears left, only heaving breaths and whimpers. The lady-in-waiting, a severe woman named Mrs. Haddington, who always looked at the guards like they were something unpleasant she had stepped in, arrived at last. She held up a small key with an air of triumph. "There now," she said briskly. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." She inserted the key into the lock. It turned part way and stopped. She tried again. Nothing. "It's stuck," she muttered. "This lock is old. It needs oiling. I'll have to fetch the master key from—" "Ma'am," Elias interrupted, his voice tight. "The princess has been crying for nearly 20 minutes. She thinks there's someone in her room." Mrs. Haddington drew herself up, offended. "Young man, I have served this household for 30 years. I will not have you tell me how to do my duty. The master key is in the housekeeper's office. I will go and get it." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the stone. Elias looked at the door. He looked at the heavy iron ring on his belt. And he looked at Captain Harris, who was watching from the end of the corridor with a warning expression that clearly said, "Don't even think about it." Through the door, he heard the princess whimper, "Please, someone. I'm scared." Elias made his decision. He stepped back from the door, raised his boot, and kicked with all his strength just below the handle. The wood groaned but held. He kicked again and again. On the 4th kick, there was a terrible splintering sound, and the door burst inward. He was through it in an instant, his hand on the small club at his belt, his eyes scanning the room for threats. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the storm outside. The curtains moved slightly in the wind from a cracked window. A wardrobe stood against one wall, its door slightly ajar. A pile of toys sat in a corner, for their shadows long and strange in the dim light. On the bed, a small figure was huddled under the covers, shaking. Elias crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed. "Your Highness, it's Elias, the guard. You're safe now. I'm here." The covers lowered just enough to reveal a pair of wide, tear-filled eyes. The little girl's face was blotchy from crying, her hair a mess. She looked at him for a long moment, then launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his neck and sobbing into his shoulder. Elias froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Then his training, not the palace training, but something older, more human, took over. He held her carefully, patting her back the way he had seen mothers do with their children. "It's all right," he murmured. "I've got you. There's nothing here that's going to hurt you. I promise." The room was empty. Elias checked the wardrobe under the bed behind the curtains. Nothing. The cracked window explained the draft, and the draft explained the moving shadows. A child alone in the dark, with a storm outside and a window that would not close properly. It was easy to see how fear could take hold, but explanations did not matter right now. What mattered was the small person clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned frightening and strange. Captain Harris appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of anger and reluctant respect. Mrs. Haddington was behind him, holding her master key and looking like she had swallowed something sour. "Well," Harris said quietly, "you're in for it now, Thorne?" Elias looked down at the princess, who was finally beginning to calm down, then her sobs softening to hiccups. "I know, sir, but she's safe. That's what matters." But as he said the words, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the floor near the window, barely visible in the dim light, was a footprint. It was large, made of mud, and it led from the window toward the door, then stopped, as if whoever had made it had simply vanished. Elias said nothing. He held the princess a little tighter and waited for the storm to pass. The morning after the break-in arrived gray and reluctant, the sun struggling to push through clouds that still hung low and heavy over the palace grounds. For most of the household, it was the start of another ordinary day. Servants bustled through corridors with linens and breakfast trays. Courtiers hurried to their offices with stacks of papers. So the great machine of the royal residence ground into motion, as it always did. But in the princess's wing, nothing was ordinary. Elias Thorne had not slept. After the night's events, he had been relieved of his post and ordered to wait in the guardroom while matters were assessed. That had been 6 hours ago. He had sat on a hard wooden bench, watching the rain-streaked windows grow light, turning over in his mind the one detail he had not shared with anyone: the footprint. He had checked the window again after the princess had finally fallen asleep, her small hand still clutching his sleeve. The window had been unlocked, the latch broken. Outside, on the wet stone of the balcony, there had been more footprints, at least 2 different sets, leading to and from the window. And beyond the balcony, on a drain pipe that led down to the gardens. Someone had been in that room. Someone had stood at the end of a 7-year-old girl's bed and watched her sleep. And then, when the crying started and the guard came, that someone had vanished. Elias had reported this to Captain Harris immediately. Harris had listened, his face growing pale, and then he had told Elias to say nothing to anyone else. "Not a word, Thorne. Not to the other guards, not to the servants, not to your mother. This is above our pay grade now." Now, as the palace clock struck 8, Elias was summoned to the king's private study. He had never been in this part of the palace before. The study was a large, comfortable room lined with books and hung with paintings of horses and ancestors. A fire crackled in the grate, chasing away the morning chill. Behind a massive oak desk sat the king, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of people watching him. Beside him stood a thin man in an expensive suit, the head of palace security, a man named Sir Alistair Finch. And in a chair near the fire, wrapped in a blanket and clutching a cup of hot chocolate, sat Princess Charlotte. She looked small and pale in the large chair, dark circles under her eyes. But when she saw Elias, her face lit up. "That's him," she said, pointing. "That's the guard who saved me." The king's eyes, which had been cold and assessing when Elias entered, softened slightly. He gestured to a chair. "Sit down, guardsman. My daughter has been telling us about last night." Elias sat, perching awkwardly on the edge of an antique chair that looked far too delicate for his weight. "Your Majesty? I apologize for breaking the door. I know it was against protocol, but—" The king held up a hand, silencing him. "Protocol. Yes. Let's talk about protocol." His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "Protocol says that my daughter should have been protected. Protocol says that no one should be able to reach her rooms. And yet last night someone did." Sir Alistair cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we don't know for certain that there was an intruder. The guard reported seeing footprints, but with the storm and the comings and goings of staff—" "The footprints were fresh," Elias said quietly. "And the window latch was broken from the outside. Someone was in that room." Charlotte nodded vigorously. "I saw him. He was tall and dark, and he just stood there looking at me. I was so scared." The king's jaw tightened. He looked at his daughter, and for a moment, Elias saw not a monarch but a father, terrified for his child. "Charlotte, sweetheart, why didn't you call for help sooner? You have a bell by your bed. The servants would have come." Charlotte looked down at her hot chocolate. "I was too scared to move. I thought if I pretended to be asleep, he would go away. But he didn't. He just stood there. And then when I couldn't pretend anymore, I started crying. And then the guard came." She looked up at Elias with something like hero worship in her eyes. "You kicked the door down. It was so loud. And then he was gone." "He was gone when I entered the room?" Elias asked carefully. Charlotte nodded. "I heard something at the window. It's just before you came in, like someone jumping." Sir Alistair and the king exchanged a look. The security chief's face was grim. "If there was an intruder, he's gone now. We've searched the grounds, questioned the staff, reviewed the security footage. Nothing. It's as if he vanished into thin air." "Then he's still out there," Elias said. "Or he had help from someone inside." The room went very quiet. The king stared at Elias for a long moment, then turned to Sir Alistair. "I want every member of this household investigated. Every servant, every guard, every courtier. I want to know who had access to that wing last night, and I want to know why our security failed." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray gardens. "My wife is beside herself with worry. My sons are frightened. And my daughter—" He stopped, with his voice catching slightly. "My daughter cannot sleep in her own bed because she's afraid the Shadow Man will come back." Charlotte slid off her chair and walked to her father, wrapping her small arms around his leg. "Papa, can the guard stay? The one who saved me? He makes me feel safe." The king looked down at her, then at Elias. "What's your name, guardsman?" "Elias Thorne, Your Majesty." "Elias Thorne." The king tested the name. "You broke down a door. You disobeyed direct orders. You acted without authorization." Elias braced himself for dismissal, perhaps even arrest. "But you also protected my daughter when no one else would." The king's voice softened. "Effective immediately, you are assigned to the princess's personal security detail. You will be her shadow. You will go where she goes, watch over her when she sleeps, and ensure that no Shadow Man or anyone else ever frightens her again." Elias blinked. "Your Majesty, I'm just a night guard. I don't have the training for—" "I don't care about your training," the king interrupted. "I care about your instincts. Last night, when protocol said wait, your instincts said act. That's what I want protecting my child." Charlotte beamed. She let go of her father and ran to Elias, throwing her arms around him. You're going to be my guard, forever and ever." Elias looked down at the small person hugging him, then at the king, who was watching with an expression that was part amusement, part something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. "Forever and ever is a long time, Your Highness," Elias said gently. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes serious. "Good, because I'm never letting you go." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Thin lines of sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds, falling across the wet gardens in long golden streaks. It was, Elias thought, the first sign of hope he had seen all day. But in the back of his mind, one thought lingered. The footprint by the window, the broken latch, the intruder who had vanished. Whoever had been in that room was still out there, and until they were found, no one was truly safe.